Hamburg, April 1945. The city was on the verge of collapse. Allied forces were closing in from the west and south, while Soviet troops advanced relentlessly from the east. Within weeks, Nazi Germany would cease to exist. In this final phase of the war, the once formidable Kriegsmarine was reduced to fragments of its former power. The great naval bases that had launched submarines and warships into the Atlantic now stood in ruins. Hamburg, once a proud center of German shipbuilding and naval command, had become a graveyard of steel. By April, the port was under constant bombardment from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force. Repeated firebombing. Raids had destroyed most of the docks, warehouses, and shipyards. The Elbe River was filled with debris and the burned remains of vessels that could no longer move. Many ships were deliberately sunk by their own crews to prevent capture, an act known as scuttling. The massive U-boat pens, including the Elbe II bunker, were still intact but useless, surrounded by rubble and without power. The last submarines built there, such as the Type 21 boats, never left the harbor. Among them was U-501, launched from Hamburg in early 1945. It was one of the revolutionary new submarines that, on paper, could have changed the war, but it never saw combat. On May 3, 1945, its crew scuttled it in front of the Elbe to bunker to keep it out of British hands. Other U-boats, U-3004, U-2505, and U-3506, met the same fate, entombed under the port where they still lie today, buried beneath modern infrastructure. What had once been Germany's cutting-edge naval technology became silent tombs in the mud of the Elbe. The sailors who remained in Hamburg understood that the war was lost. Supplies had stopped arriving. Many of them were teenagers or older reservists, hastily assigned to defend the ruins of the city. They were no longer part of an organized navy, merely fragments of a defeated force. Communication with Berlin was chaotic, and Hitler's orders to fight to the last man were ignored more and more frequently. In the bunkers, officers argued over whether to continue resistance or negotiate surrender. The British advance toward Hamburg began in mid-April 1945. Units of the British 21st Army Group pushed north, encountering scattered resistance. Within the city, what remained of the Kriegsmarine manned anti-aircraft batteries and defended bridges and docks. These were not conventional naval battles, but desperate, ground-based defenses. The same sailors who once served on destroyers and submarines now fought street to street with rifles. Many civilians fled to the countryside or hid in the underground shelters as artillery fire drew closer each day. By April 30th, Berlin was surrounded, and word of Hitler's suicide spread rapidly across the country. In Hamburg, the naval command realized that the end was inevitable. On May 2nd, local German officers entered discussions with British commanders. The following day, May 3, 1945, the city officially surrendered to the British 7th Armored Division. For the sailors who had survived the bombings and the final siege, the surrender meant not only the end of the war, but the end of the Kriegsmarine itself. In the days that followed, British engineers inspected the wrecks in the harbor. They found dozens of scuttled submarines and destroyers, intentionally sunk to prevent capture. The Kriegsmarine as an institution was dissolved on May 8, 1945, when Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The few ships still afloat were taken as war prizes or scrapped. The once mighty German Navy, which had dreamed of controlling the Atlantic, ceased to exist. Hamburg became a symbol of that downfall. The Elbe River, once crowded with warships, was now a silent grave. Beneath the surface, the steel remains of the last submarines rested in the dark, the final witnesses of a navy that had fought until its empire collapsed around it. By late April 1945, the port of Hamburg had lost nearly all its operational capacity. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns that had begun in 1943 had left the shipyards in ruins, and what remained was being dismantled by the chaos of Germany's final collapse. The Royal Air Force's Operation Gomorrah 2 years earlier had already reduced much of the city to ashes, but by 1945, precision attacks targeted what was left of the Kriegsmarine's infrastructure, fuel depots, submarine pens, and ship repair docks. Each new raid crippled the ability of the Navy to move, refuel, or even communicate. The Elba II submarine bunker was one of the last fortified naval sites still standing in Hamburg. Built to shelter the new Type 21 U-boats, it was a concrete colossus designed to resist airstrikes. Yet even there, power failures, lack of diesel, and blocked waterways rendered the fleet inert. Engineers who had once been proud to work on the most advanced submarines in the world now dismantled vital components to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. Many commanders received direct orders from Berlin to scuttle their ships if surrender seemed imminent. For the German Navy, the final months were not about fighting at sea. They were about ensuring their own destruction before capture. Across the harbor, the situation was equally dire. The once busy Blohm and Voss shipyard, where warships such as the battleship Bismarck had been constructed, lay in ruins. Bomb craters filled with stagnant water, cranes toppled, and steel frames stood like skeletons against the smoke-filled sky. Workers were gone, replaced by soldiers and sailors who used the ruins for makeshift defense positions. Food was scarce, and many of the remaining personnel were civilians pressed into service. British reconnaissance flights over the Elbe showed almost no naval activity. The few remaining vessels visible from the air were derelict or half-submerged. On the riverbanks, sunken barges and ferries formed blockades, deliberate obstacles meant to slow the Allied approach. Some of these were filled with explosives, a last attempt to defend the port if British forces entered the city. Yet, these desperate measures were largely symbolic. There was no longer a functioning command structure to coordinate resistance. In these final weeks, the role of the Kriegsmarine changed completely. It was no longer a navy in the traditional sense, but a fragmented force supporting ground operations. Naval personnel manned coastal artillery and anti-aircraft guns, guarding bridges and supply routes. Their uniforms, once symbols of maritime power, were covered in the dust of urban warfare. In many cases, sailors fought alongside army units or local militias in the streets of Hamburg. Few had any combat experience on land, and their efforts were mostly uncoordinated. The psychological collapse of the German Navy mirrored that of the entire Reich. Propaganda had promised miracle weapons and final victories, but the reality in Hamburg was starvation, exhaustion, and disillusionment. Desertions increased sharply. Some officers still tried to enforce discipline, executing those accused of cowardice, while others quietly surrendered to the advancing British. There were also instances of sailors defying orders to scuttle ships, preferring to save lives rather than obey futile commands from Berlin. By the last days of April, British artillery could be heard across the city. The port area, once filled with the roar of engines and ship horns, was now silent except for distant explosions. Communication lines had collapsed. The last functioning radio transmissions from Hamburg's Naval Command reported enemy contact at the outskirts before falling silent. On May 2nd, British troops entered the southern suburbs. By May 3rd, organized resistance had ended. The Kriegsmarine personnel, still present in the port, laid down their arms or were taken prisoner. When the British entered the harbor, they found a surreal scene. The docks were filled with wrecks, some half-sunken, others burnt to their waterlines. Submarines lay on their sides, their hulls cracked open. British engineers documented dozens of self-sabotage vessels, a systematic scuttling operation carried out before the surrender. The decision reflected both discipline and despair, to destroy what remained of a navy that could no longer sail. In the end, the sea that had once empowered Germany's ambitions became its grave. The waters of the Elbe swallowed the last remnants of the Kriegsmarine. Within days, the war in Europe was over. For the men who had served at sea, there was no glory left, only wreckage and silence. After the surrender of Hamburg on May 3, 1945, what remained of the Kriegsmarine was no longer a navy, but a collection of scattered personnel and wrecked ships. The official dissolution of the German armed forces was only days away, but the psychological collapse had already occurred. For many sailors, the war had ended before the paperwork did. Their uniforms, ranks, and orders no longer meant anything in a country that no longer existed. The mutinies that had begun quietly in April became more visible once news of Hitler's death spread. With Berlin fallen and the Nazi command disintegrating, many officers faced impossible choices: to obey orders that no longer made sense, or to preserve their men's lives by surrendering. In Hamburg, several groups of sailors refused to carry out final sabotage instructions. These acts were not organized rebellions, but instinctive refusals to continue a meaningless war. Others, however, followed the doctrine of total obedience to the end, destroying their ships and infrastructure in accordance with the scorched earth policy still enforced by loyal Nazi commanders. This mixture of defiance and loyalty produced confusion across the port. Some units fired on others who attempted to surrender, while others simply deserted. In one instance, recorded by British intelligence, a Naval Guard unit shot at civilians trying to reach the British lines, mistaking them for saboteurs. At the same time, groups of sailors gathered to negotiate local ceasefires with advancing British patrols. The fragmented nature of these events made Hamburg's final hours chaotic and tense. The British 7th Armored Division entered Hamburg under a flag of truce. They were met by German officers from the local command, including representatives of the Kriegsmarine. The surrender terms were straightforward. The city would capitulate unconditionally, and all remaining military forces were to hand over their weapons. In return, British commanders agreed to maintain order and allow food and medical supplies to enter the city. This moment marked not only the end of resistance in northern Germany, but also the symbolic death of the Kriegsmarine as a fighting force. For the British forces, the port of Hamburg was an extraordinary sight. Hundreds of vessels, submarines, destroyers, minesweepers, and merchant ships lay destroyed or abandoned. Many of them had been scuttled in shallow water, leaving their conning towers and decks visible above the surface. The Elba II submarine bunker was nearly intact, but its entrances were blocked by sunken boats. British engineers and naval experts were astonished by what they found. Advanced submarines that had never seen combat, some still brand new, their engines unused, their interiors untouched. The Type 21 submarines in particular drew great interest. These were the first true electric boats, capable of staying underwater for extended periods, thanks to their streamlined design and advanced battery systems. British and American technical teams began immediate salvage operations to study them. Some of the captured submarines were refloated and towed to Britain for analysis. Others were handed over to the Soviets as part of the post-war division of spoils. In a sense, the last legacy of the Kriegsmarine lived on, not through victory, but through the technological curiosity of its conquerors. For the sailors who survived, life after the surrender was uncertain. Thousands were taken prisoner and sent to POW camps across northern Germany and the United Kingdom. Others were released to return home, only to find their families displaced or their cities destroyed. Many spoke later of the strange emptiness they felt after the surrender, a silence after years of propaganda, duty, and fear. In interviews conducted years later, former sailors described the final days as a time of waiting for reality to arrive, a moment when the world they knew dissolved without ceremony. The Allied occupation forces immediately began clearing the port. Explosives experts neutralized scuttled ships to prevent further detonations, while divers inspected the harbors for mines and fuel leaks. The British quickly recognized the strategic importance of the port facilities for post-war recovery. Within weeks, parts of the docks were reopened under Allied control to bring in humanitarian aid and materials for reconstruction. The same harbor that had once launched U-boats into the Atlantic now received Red Cross shipments and food for starving civilians. The end of the Kriegsmarine was not marked by a single explosion or last stand, but by slow decay and surrender. Its command structure was dissolved officially on May 8, 1945, the day of Germany's unconditional capitulation. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state, ordered all naval personnel to cease hostilities. In a final radio broadcast, he called upon the sailors to end the struggle in dignity and obedience. Those words, though meant as a farewell to a proud tradition, were in reality an acknowledgement of total defeat. In Hamburg, that defeat was visible everywhere. In the sunken submarines along the Elbe, in the silent docks, in the empty barracks filled with abandoned uniforms. The navy that had once dreamed of ruling the seas had ended in its own harbor, not by battle, but by exhaustion. The war that began with ambition on the ocean ended with wrecks buried in the mud. And in that quiet, the history of the Kriegsmarine closed, a story of power, innovation, and ultimately, destruction. The fall of Hamburg marked one of the final major German surrenders in World War II. After May 3, 1945, British forces took full control of the city and its port, which had once been among the busiest in Europe. The operation was quick and largely bloodless, the result of exhausted German troops unwilling to continue fighting. The British 7th Armored Division, supported by the 11th Armored and Airborne units, entered the city under strict orders to avoid unnecessary destruction. They encountered scattered pockets of resistance, mostly fanatical SS elements, but by nightfall the fighting was over. The following days revealed the full scale of the devastation. Nearly 80% of Hamburg's port facilities were destroyed. The Blohm and Voss shipyards, which had built some of the Kriegsmarine's most famous warships, including the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, were little more than burned metal and rubble. Docks were blocked by wrecked cranes and barges, the river choked with the remains of scuttled submarines. British engineers mapped the wrecks one by one, estimating that more than 150 vessels had been sunk in or near the harbors in combat, others deliberately destroyed by their own crews during the final days. The British command, led locally by General Brian Horrocks, quickly organized security and relief efforts. The immediate priority was to clear mines and restore minimal port operations to supply food to civilians. More than 1 million people were still living in the ruined city, many without clean water or shelter. Naval officers of the surrendered Kriegsmarine were ordered to assist in salvage and cleanup operations. For many of them, this was an ironic reversal. The same men who had once launched submarines into the Atlantic were now hauling wreckage out of the Elbe under Allied supervision. British naval experts examined what remained of the German fleet with both caution and fascination. The discovery of advanced submarines, such as the Type 21 and Type 23, drew significant attention from Allied intelligence. These models had been capable of underwater speeds exceeding anything in the Allied fleets and were seen as precursors to the modern submarine. Some of these vessels were floated and repaired, were sent to Britain and the United States for study. Others were distributed among the Allies under the tripartite naval commission agreements, which divided the captured German Navy into 3 portions, for the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union. In Hamburg, the British Occupation Administration implemented strict regulations to prevent looting and maintain order. Civilian movement near the docks was restricted, and German sailors were confined to designated camps. The former Naval Command buildings were converted into Allied offices, and the remaining naval archives were seized. These documents provided valuable insight into German naval production, U-boat operations, and technology transferred during the war. Many of these records later formed the foundation for post-war studies on submarine warfare. For the residents of Hamburg, daily life in May 1945 was a struggle for survival. Food rations were minimal, infrastructure was nearly destroyed, and thousands of refugees from Eastern Germany flooded into the city seeking shelter. Despite this, the occupation of Hamburg was relatively stable compared to the chaos in Berlin or the violence in Eastern territories. The British authorities emphasized discipline and humanitarian relief rather than retribution. Under their control, the port slowly began to function again, symbolizing both the end of war and the beginning of reconstruction. The Kriegsmarine, as an institution, officially ceased to exist on May 8, 1945. Its officers were demobilized, and its ships either surrendered or destroyed. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had governed the remnants of Nazi Germany from Flensburg after Hitler's death, ordered all naval units to surrender unconditionally. When Dönitz himself was captured by British troops on May 23rd, it marked the final dissolution of organized German military power. In the weeks that followed, the British repurposed parts of Hamburg's naval infrastructure for their own use. The large U-boat bunkers became storage facilities and repair depots for Allied vessels. Salvage operations continued throughout the summer, removing mines and clearing navigation routes along the Elbe. Teams of divers documented the scuttled submarines, many of which were left in place because of the danger involved in moving them. Even today, Some of these wrecks remain buried beneath the port's modern structures, silent reminders of the last days of the German Navy. The fall of Hamburg was both an end and a beginning. It closed the final chapter of Nazi Germany's naval ambitions and opened a period of Allied reconstruction that would reshape Europe. For the sailors of the Kriegsmarine, captivity and reflection replaced duty and combat. For the Allies, Hamburg became a laboratory for post-war administration, a city that embodied both the horrors of total war and the potential for recovery. By the summer of 1945, the once feared German Navy was gone, replaced by Allied patrols and humanitarian convoys entering the same docks where U-boats had once departed for the Atlantic. The sound of engines and gunfire had faded, leaving only the slow rhythm of cranes, the creak of ships being unloaded, and the long process of rebuilding a city and a continent from the ruins. The surrender of Hamburg and the collapse of the Kriegsmarine marked not only the end of Germany's naval warfare in World War II, but the end of an entire era of maritime militarism. In the weeks following May 1945, the British Royal Navy and Allied occupation forces began cataloging and dismantling what was left of Hitler's fleet. The figures tell the story clearly. Out of more than 1,150 U-boats built during the war, only a handful remained afloat by the time of surrender. Over 780 had been lost in combat, and more than 200 were scuttled by their own crews to avoid capture. The Elbe River and the ports of northern Germany were filled with wrecks. Some were salvaged to clear navigation lanes, while others were simply left to rust beneath the waterline. The majority of surviving U-boats were gathered under Operation Deadlight, a post-war Allied mission conducted between late 1945 and early 1946 to dispose of the captured submarines. More than 100 of them were towed out into the North Atlantic and deliberately sunk. For the Royal Navy, it was a symbolic act, a burial of the weapon that had once terrorized Allied shipping. For the Germans who had served aboard those vessels, it was the last chapter of their war at sea. Hamburg itself began a slow recovery. The British established a military government that prioritized restoring the port's basic functions. Former Kriegsmarine engineers were employed to repair docks, rebuild cranes, and refloat ships. Many of them worked under close Allied supervision, but their expertise proved essential to the reconstruction effort. By the end of 1946, the port of Hamburg was once again operational, this time as a center for trade and humanitarian relief rather than warfare. In 1949, with the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, plans for a modest new navy began to emerge. This force, established officially in 1956 as the Bundesmarine, now the Deutsche Marine, was built under NATO supervision and dedicated to defensive purposes only. Many of its early officers were former Kriegsmarine personnel who had been vetted and retrained under strict Allied oversight. They brought with them technical experience, but operated under a completely different political and ethical framework. The lessons of the war and of the Kriegsmarine's downfall shaped the philosophy of the new German Navy: deterrence through cooperation, not domination. For historians, the final stand of the Kriegsmarine in Hamburg remains a powerful illustration of the futility of total war. Despite technological innovation and early successes, the Navy could not overcome the industrial and logistical superiority of the Allies. By 1945, the Third Reich's naval ambitions had collapsed under their own contradictions. A fleet without fuel, orders without meaning, sailors without a cause. The scuttled submarines beneath the port became silent monuments to that realization. In the decades that followed, underwater surveys of the Elbe uncovered many of those remains. The wrecks of U-501 and others were found buried beneath layers of silt, preserved almost perfectly. They now rest beneath modern Hamburg, sealed off from the public but occasionally studied by marine archaeologists. Each submarine tells the same story of technological brilliance, human endurance, and inevitable defeat. The Kriegsmarine's legacy is therefore not one of glory but of consequence. It demonstrated how the pursuit of power through militarization can destroy even the institutions that sustain it. The sailors who scuttled their ships in the last days of the war were not only obeying orders, they were, in a sense, burying the illusions of the regime they once served. When the British raised their flag over Hamburg, they inherited a city of ruins and ghosts, but also the opportunity to rebuild something entirely different. By the end of 1945, the fires of war had gone out across Europe. The Elbe River, once black with oil and smoke, flowed quietly again. The cranes of the rebuilt port would soon lift supplies instead of weapons, and the docks that had witnessed destruction would become symbols of recovery. The final stand of the Kriegsmarine was not a grand naval battle, but a slow surrender to inevitability, a story of machines, overtaken by history, and men learning, too late, that no empire built on aggression can stand forever.